David Williams had always been the kind of man who needed everything in its proper place. His apartment in downtown Seattle looked like something from a magazine. Clean lines, neutral colors, and not a single thing out of order. At 34, he had built a successful career as an architect, designing office buildings and shopping centers that made him good money and gave him the control. He craved over his world. Every morning, David followed the same routine. Coffee at exactly 6:30 a.m., shower at 6:45, dressed and out the door by 7:30. His co-workers knew him as reliable, professional, and slightly distant. He was the guy who always had his projects finished on time, but never joined the team for drinks. After work, 3 years earlier, his marriage had ended badly, and since then, David had decided that keeping people at arm's length was safer than letting them get close enough to hurt him. That Tuesday evening in March started like any other. David had stayed late at the office, working on plans for a new shopping complex. The rain was coming down hard, turning the Seattle streets into rivers of headlights and brake lights. He was thinking about the Chinese takeout he'd grab on his way home, maybe catching up on some TV shows he'd been meaning to watch. Life was predictable, and that's exactly how he liked it. The intersection of Pine Street and 4th Avenue was busy. Even at 7 p.m., David stopped at the red light, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm of the jazz music playing softly on his radio. He watched the pedestrians hurrying past, umbrellas bent against the wind, everyone eager to get somewhere warm and dry. The light turned green, and David pressed the gas pedal, moving forward into the intersection just like he had thousands of times before. He never saw the other car coming. The impact happened so fast that David's brain couldn't process it at first. One moment he was driving normally, thinking about dinner. The next, his world exploded into a symphony of crushing metal, shattering glass, and spinning motion. The other driver had been texting, running the red light at 45 miles per hour. David's sedan crumpled like paper as it was pushed sideways across the wet asphalt. When the spinning stopped, David found himself hanging upside down, held in place by his seatbelt. His ears were ringing, and something warm was dripping down his forehead. But the worst part wasn't the blood or the pain shooting through his back. It was the fact that he couldn't feel his legs at all. He tried to move them, tried to push against the floor of the car, but nothing happened. It was like his body had been cut in half. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but to David, it felt like hours. Paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him, talking in medical terms he didn't understand. Words like spinal trauma and possible compression floated around him as they carefully extracted him from the wreckage. During the ambulance ride to the hospital, David stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. Just an hour ago, he had been walking around his office. Now he couldn't even wiggle his toes. The next few days at the hospital passed in a blur of doctors, tests, and worried faces. The diagnosis was both better and worse than David had feared. His spine hadn't been severed, which meant the paralysis might be temporary, but two vertebrae in his lower back had been compressed, and the swelling was putting pressure on his spinal cord. The doctors couldn't say for sure whether he'd walk again or when. It could be weeks, months, or possibly never. For a man who had spent his entire adult life in control, this uncertainty was almost worse than the physical pain. David had always been the one who fixed problems, who had solutions, who didn't need help from anyone. Now he couldn't even get out of bed without assistance. The simplest tasks, eating, washing, even using the bathroom, required someone else's help. It was humiliating and terrifying at the same time. When the hospital finally discharged him 3 weeks later, David's apartment had been transformed. His insurance had paid for a hospital bed to be set up in his living room, along with a wheelchair, walker, and various medical equipment. Handrails had been installed in the bathroom, and ramps had been built over the small steps at his front door. The clean, ordered space that had once given him comfort now felt like a prison. That's when Isabella Rodriguez entered his life. Isabella was 29 years old and had been working as a home care nurse for 6 years. She had seen every kind of patient, elderly people recovering from surgery, young parents dealing with chronic illness, and accident victims learning to live with new limitations. But something about David's case touched her differently. Maybe it was the way he tried so hard to seem okay when she could see the fear in his eyes. Or maybe it was how he apologized every time she helped him with something, as if needing assistance was somehow his fault. Isabella had grown up taking care of people. When she was 12, her mother had been diagnosed with a serious illness that required constant attention. While other kids were playing sports or hanging out with friends, Isabella was learning how to give medications, help with physical therapy, and provide the kind of emotional support that no child should have to give. Her mother had passed away when Isabella was 18, but those years had taught her something important, that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken in someone's body. It was about fixing what was broken in their spirit too. On Isabella's first day caring for David, she could see that his physical injuries were only part of the problem. He was polite but distant, answering her questions with short responses and avoiding eye contact. He insisted on trying to do things himself, even when it clearly caused him pain. When she suggested they work on some simple exercises to help with his recovery, he agreed but seemed to be going through the motions without any real hope. The first night was the worst. Isabella had planned to stay until David was settled for the evening, then come back in the morning. But as she was preparing to leave around 9 p.m., she noticed that David seemed increasingly anxious. His breathing was shallow, and his hands were shaking slightly. When she asked if he was okay, he insisted he was fine, but Isabella had seen these signs before. She knew that nighttime was often the hardest time for people dealing with trauma. Sure enough, around midnight, David's worst fears came crashing down on him. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, completely disoriented. For a moment, he forgot about the accident and tried to get out of bed normally when his legs wouldn't respond. Panic set in. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but lie there as waves of terror washed over him. The silence of his apartment seemed to press in on him from all sides. That's when he heard Isabella's voice from the chair beside his bed. "David, you're safe. You're in your apartment. I'm right here with you." She had never actually left. Something in her experience told her that this man, who had spent so much energy trying to appear strong and independent, was going to need someone to help him through the dark hours when all his defenses were down. Isabella didn't make a big deal about staying. She simply pulled a comfortable chair up beside David's bed and settled in for the night. When he protested that she didn't need to stay, that he would be fine on his own, she just smiled and said, "I know you'll be fine, but I'm staying anyway." It was the first time since the accident that David didn't feel completely alone with his fears. As David's breathing slowly returned to normal and his heart stopped racing, he realized something that both comforted and terrified him. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't sleeping alone, and for the first time since the accident, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. What started as one emergency night slowly became something neither David nor Isabella had planned. The next evening, Isabella arrived at her usual time, officially ending her shift at 8 p.m. But as she gathered her things to leave, she noticed David's hand starting to shake again. His breathing was getting faster, and he kept glancing toward the windows as darkness fell outside. Without saying a word, Isabella set her bag down and pulled the chair back to its spot beside his bed. "You don't have to stay," David said quietly, but his voice carried no conviction. The truth was, he was dreading another night alone with his thoughts and fears. "I know," Isabella replied, settling into the chair with a book she'd brought, "but I want to." This became their unspoken routine each day. Isabella would arrive to help David with his physical therapy, medications, and basic care. She was professional and skilled, always knowing exactly what he needed before he had to ask. But as evening approached, something shifted between them. The formal nurse-patient relationship gave way to something more human, more real. David fought against needing her presence more than he fought against his physical limitations. He was a man who had prided himself on independence, who had built his entire adult life around not depending on anyone. Having Isabella there every night felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that he was broken in ways that went beyond his injured spine. Some nights, he would pretend to be asleep when she arrived, hoping she would see that he was fine and leave him alone. Other nights, he would insist loudly that he didn't need a babysitter, that he was perfectly capable of spending the night by himself. But Isabella had worked with enough patience to recognize the difference between genuine independence and stubborn pride. She could see the fear lurking behind his protests, She said one evening as David was going through his usual routine of insisting he was fine, "There's nothing wrong with needing someone. We all need people sometimes. I don't." David replied automatically, the same response he'd been giving for years. Isabella looked at him thoughtfully. "When I was growing up, my mom got really sick. I spent most of my teenage years taking care of her. I thought I was so strong, so independent after she died. I was convinced I could handle anything on my own." She paused, folding her hands in her lap. "It took me years to realize that being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. Sometimes it means being brave enough to let someone help you." David didn't respond, but Isabella could see her words had hit something inside him. She didn't push the subject. Instead, she simply stayed, creating a presence that was both comforting and undemanding. Slowly, night by night, David began to open up. It started with small things, comments about the weather, questions about Isabella's day, observations about the TV shows they watched together. Isabella never pried or pushed him to talk. She simply made herself available, creating a safe space where David could share as much or as little as he wanted. 3 weeks into their evening routine, the breakthrough came. David had been having the same nightmare almost every night. Vivid replay of the accident where he could see the other car coming, but couldn't make his body move fast enough to avoid it. Usually, he would wake up quietly, dealing with the aftermath of fear and panic on his own. But this particular night, the dream was more intense than usual. He woke up screaming, his body drenched in sweat, completely disoriented. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was still trapped in his crumpled car, still hanging upside down with glass in his hair and blood on his face. His heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might explode, and he couldn't catch his breath. Isabella was beside him instantly, her voice calm and steady. "David, you're safe. You're in your apartment. The accident is over. You're safe now." She repeated these words like a mantra, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. But David was too deep in his panic to hear her. The fear that had been building inside him for weeks finally erupted. He began to cry, not the quiet, controlled tears of someone trying to maintain dignity, but the raw, broken sobs of someone who had been holding too much pain inside for too long. Without hesitation, Isabella climbed onto the bed beside him. She was still fully dressed, still professional, but in that moment, she was also just one human being comforting another. She held him as he cried, not saying anything, just being present for his pain. "I'm scared," David whispered between sobs. "I'm so scared all the time." "I know," Isabella said softly. "It's okay to be scared. What happened to you was terrifying." As David's crying gradually subsided, he began to talk. The words came slowly, at first, then faster, as if a dam had burst inside him. He told Isabella about the accident, about the moment when he realized he couldn't move his legs, about the terror of not knowing if he would ever walk again. But he also told her about older fears, about how his mother had left when he was 12, walking out one day and never coming back, about how he had spent years taking care of his younger sister while his father worked constantly, just to keep them afloat. "I learned early that people leave," David said, his voice raw from crying, "so I stopped letting people get close enough to hurt me." Isabella listened without judgment, without trying to fix or minimize his pain. She understood that David wasn't just recovering from a car accident. He was dealing with a lifetime of building walls around his heart, walls that the accident had cracked wide open. "Your mother leaving wasn't your fault," she said gently. "And needing help now doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. As the night wore on, David found himself telling Isabella things he had never told anyone. About the loneliness that had been eating at him for years. About how he threw himself into work to avoid dealing with his feelings. About how terrified he was that he might never be the same person he was before the accident. Isabella shared her own stories too. She told him about the guilt she felt after her mother died, wondering if she had done enough. About how she became a nurse partly to help others, but also to feel useful, needed. About her own struggles with letting people get close to her, afraid that caring too much would only lead to more lost by the time morning came. Something fundamental had shifted between them. David had let someone see him at his most vulnerable, and Isabella had proven that she wasn't going anywhere. The walls that David had spent years building were starting to crumble, and for the first time since the accident, he felt like maybe that wasn't such a terrible thing. When Isabella finally got up to make them both coffee, David realized that the crushing fear he'd been carrying for weeks had lifted slightly. He still didn't know if he would walk again, still didn't know what his future would look like, but he was no longer facing those uncertainties completely alone. "Thank you," he said when Isabella returned with two steaming mugs. "For what?" she asked, settling back into her chair. "For not leaving," David replied. "For refusing to let me do this alone." Isabella smiled, and David saw something in her eyes that he was only beginning to understand, the look of someone who had found purpose in caring for another person, not out of obligation, but out of genuine compassion. In that moment, he realized that their evening routine had become as important to her as it was to him. After that night when David finally broke down and let Isabella see his deepest fears, something beautiful began to happen. The healing process wasn't just about his spine anymore. It was about learning to trust again, to hope again, and to believe that maybe he didn't have to face life completely alone. Isabella's supervisor at the nursing agency, Mrs. Chen, started asking questions about why Isabella was logging so many hours at David's apartment. During their weekly team meetings, she would pull Isabella aside with a concerned look on her face. "You're spending an awful lot of time with this patient," Mrs. Chen said one Thursday morning. "Your timesheets show you're there 12 hours a day, sometimes more. That's not normal, Isabella." Isabella felt her cheeks flush. She knew her coworkers had started whispering about her dedication to David's case. During lunch breaks, she would catch them glancing at her and then looking away when she noticed. Some of them joked that she had developed feelings for her patient, but Isabella always brushed off their comments with a laugh. The truth was more complicated than what anyone could see from the outside. Yes, Isabella was spending more time with David than her job required, but she was also seeing results that amazed everyone involved in his care. His physical therapy sessions, which had started as painful, discouraging struggles, were now showing remarkable progress. The doctors had expected his recovery to take at least a year, possibly longer. Instead, David was hitting recovery milestones, months ahead of schedule. 3 months after the accident, David took his first steps with a walker. Isabella was there when it happened. During what was supposed to be a routine physical therapy session, David had been working with the parallel bars, trying to build strength in his legs, when suddenly he felt something different, a tingling sensation ran down his right leg, followed by actual feeling in his foot. "Isabella," he called out, his voice shaking with excitement. "I can feel my toes." Isabella rushed over, her professional training kicking in as she helped David test his newfound sensation. But when he managed to take 3 shaky steps with the walker, her professional composure cracked completely. Tears streamed down her face as she watched this man who had been confined to a wheelchair for months literally take his first steps back toward his old life. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it?" David looked at her, his own eyes wet with tears. "We did it," he corrected her. "I couldn't have done this without you." That night, as they celebrated this milestone with takeout from David's favorite restaurant, Isabella found herself thinking about how much their relationship had changed. She no longer saw David as just another patient to care for somewhere. Along the way, He had become important to her in a way that went beyond professional duty. David was experiencing his own realization. Isabella had become the best part of his day, the person he most looked forward to seeing. When she arrived each morning, his whole apartment seemed to brighten. When she stayed through the evening, he felt safe and cared for in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. But it wasn't just about the big moments like learning to walk again. It was the small things that made their bond special. Isabella had started bringing groceries and cooking meals for David, saying it was more efficient than ordering takeout every night. But David noticed that she always made his favorite foods, remembered exactly how he liked his coffee, and seemed to know instinctively when he needed comfort food versus something healthier. They had developed their own little routines that had nothing to do with medical care. Isabella would arrive with ingredients for dinner, and David would watch her cook from his wheelchair, offering suggestions and commentary. They would eat together while watching the evening news, debating politics and current events. After dinner, they would work on a jigsaw puzzle that Isabella had brought, or David would show her architectural drawings he was working on for his job. David had started working from home, taking on smaller projects that he could manage while recovering. Isabella became his unofficial assistant, helping him organize his papers, making phone calls when his energy was low, and offering encouragement when he felt frustrated with his limitations. "You know," David said one evening as they worked on a particularly difficult section of a 1,000-piece puzzle, "I never used to like puzzles. I thought they were a waste of time." "What changed your mind?" Isabella asked, carefully placing a piece of blue sky. "I realize they're not about getting to the end quickly," David replied. "They're about enjoying the process, piece by piece, kind of like getting better, I guess." Isabella smiled, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. David's recovery wasn't just about reaching the finish line of walking normally again. It was about learning to appreciate each small victory, each moment of progress, each day of feeling a little bit stronger. As David's mobility improved, Isabella began to worry about something she hadn't expected. What would happen when he no longer needed her care? The thought of their evening routine ending, of not seeing David every day, filled her with a sadness she couldn't quite explain. David was having similar thoughts. His insurance would only cover nursing care for a limited time, and he was already much more independent than when Isabella had first started caring for him. Soon, he would be able to manage on his own, and Isabella would move on to her next patient. One evening, as Isabella was helping David with his stretching exercises, he asked a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Isabella, do you think I'm getting better because of the medical care or because of something else?" Isabella paused, considering her answer carefully. "I think healing happens on different levels," she said finally. "Your body is healing because of the medical treatment, the physical therapy, the medications. But there's another kind of healing that happens when someone believes in you, when they refuse to give up on you even when you want to give up on yourself." David nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I haven't felt this hopeful about anything in years," he admitted. "Not just about walking again, but about life in general. I forgot what it felt like to look forward to tomorrow." Isabella's heart swelled with something that felt dangerously close to love. She had helped many patients recover from injuries and illnesses, but she had never felt this personally invested in someone's healing journey. David wasn't just getting better. He was becoming the person he was meant to be before life had taught him to build walls around his heart. "You know what I think," Isabella said, finishing up his exercises. "I think you're not just healing from the accident. You're healing from everything that hurt you before the accident too." David looked at her with something that might have been wonder. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "See things in me that I can't see in myself." Isabella smiled, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Maybe that's what people do for each other when they really care. They hold up a mirror that shows the good things, the strong things, the beautiful things that are already there." As they settled into their evening routine, David realized that Isabella had given him something more valuable than medical care. She had given him hope, companionship, and a reason to believe that his life could be fuller and richer than it had ever been before. The question that scared him most was whether he would be able to keep these gifts when her job was finished and their time together came to an end. 6 months after the accident that had changed everything, David stood in his apartment without any assistance. His legs were steady beneath him, and he could walk from room to room without even thinking about it. The doctors called his recovery miraculous. His physical therapist said she had never seen someone bounce back so completely from such a serious spinal injury. But David knew the real miracle wasn't just in his healed spine, it was in the way Isabella had helped heal his heart. That Tuesday evening in September, Isabella arrived at David's apartment with news that hit him like another collision. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the same professional expression she had worn on her first day caring for him. "David," she began, her voice careful and measured, "Dr. Peterson and I have been talking. Your recovery has been incredible. You're walking normally, you're back to work. You're managing all your daily activities independently." She paused, and David felt his stomach drop. "We think it's time to transition you to weekly check-ins instead of daily visits." The words hit David harder than he had expected. He had known this day would come, had even been dreading it for weeks, but hearing it spoken out loud felt like losing something precious, something he wasn't ready to give up. "So you won't be coming every day anymore?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "No," Isabella replied, and David thought he heard a note of sadness in her voice too. "You don't need daily care anymore. You've recovered beyond what anyone thought possible." That night, for the first time in months, David was truly alone. Isabella had left after their conversation, saying she would see him the following week for his first weekly appointment. The apartment felt enormous and empty without her presence. David found himself listening for her key in the lock, waiting for her familiar voice calling out that she was there. He tried to go to sleep at his usual time, but sleep wouldn't come. For 6 months, Isabella had been there every evening, creating a sense of safety and companionship that David had grown to depend on. Now, lying in his bed alone, he realized something that terrified him. Somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with the woman who had saved his life. The next few days were torture. David functioned normally during the day, working on his architectural projects, walking around the city, proving to himself that he was indeed fully recovered. But the evenings felt endless. He would make dinner for one, watch television alone, and go to bed in a silent apartment that felt more like a tomb than a home. It wasn't just that he missed Isabella's company, though he did. It was that he had lost his sense of purpose. For months, his goal had been to get better, to heal, to prove that he could overcome his injuries. Now that he had achieved that goal, he felt lost. What was he supposed to do with his life now? Go back to the same isolated existence he had lived before the accident? Meanwhile, Isabella was struggling with her own crisis. She had taken on a new patient, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, but found herself constantly distracted. She would catch herself thinking about David during the day, wondering what he was doing, whether he was eating properly, whether he was lonely. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, noticed the change in Isabella's demeanor immediately. "You seem distracted lately," she commented during one of their weekly meetings. "Is everything okay?" Isabella wanted to explain that she was worried about David, that she missed their evening conversations, that she felt like she had left a job half-finished. But she couldn't find the words to express feelings that she wasn't sure she understood. Herself at home in her own apartment, Isabella found herself looking at her phone, wanting to call David to check on him. She had his number for emergencies, but what would she say? That she was worried about him? That she missed him? That caring for him had become the most meaningful part of her day? Isabella had been a nurse long enough to know that patients sometimes develop strong feelings for their caregivers. She had seen it happen before. Someone who had been vulnerable and dependent would confuse gratitude with love, attachment with genuine affection. She had always been careful to maintain professional boundaries precisely to avoid these complications. But what she felt for David was different. She had cared for hundreds of patients over the years, but none of them had affected her the way David had. She found herself thinking about their conversations, laughing at memories of his dry humor, feeling proud of his progress as if it were her own achievement. 2 weeks after their last daily visit, Isabella made a decision that went against everything she had been taught about professional boundaries. She drove to David's apartment, not as his nurse, but as someone who needed to see him again. When David opened the door and saw her standing there, his face lit up in a way that made Isabella's heart skip. He looked healthy and strong, but there was something in his eyes that looked tired, maybe even sad. "Isabella," he said, stepping aside to let her in, "is everything okay? Do you need something?" "I need to talk to you," she said, suddenly feeling nervous. "About us. About what happened between us during your recovery." They sat in David's living room, the same space where Isabella had spent so many evenings helping him heal. But now the dynamic was different. They weren't nurse and patient anymore. They were just two people who had shared something profound and were trying to figure out what it meant. "David," Isabella began, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. The feelings you have for me, are they real? Or are they just because I helped you when you were vulnerable?" David looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I've been asking myself the same question," he said. "I know that patients sometimes develop feelings for their caregivers. I know that trauma can create bonds that feel stronger than they really are." Isabella felt her heart sink, but David continued. "But I also know that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude. It's not just because you helped me walk again, or because you stayed with me through the worst time of my life." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm in love with you, Isabella. Not with my nurse. Not with the person who saved me, but with you, the woman who laughs at terrible movies, who makes the best coffee I've ever tasted, who listens to my stories about work like they're the most interesting things in the world." Isabella felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "I'm in love with you too," she whispered. "And it scares me because I don't know if it's real, or if it's just because caring for you became so important to me." David reached for her hand. "Then let's find out," he said. "Let's start over, not as patient and caregiver, but as two people who want to know each other better." That evening, they went on their first real date. David took Isabella to a small restaurant downtown, the same place where he used to eat alone before the accident. But this time, the conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter and genuine connection. They talked about their hopes for the future, their fears, their dreams. As they walked back to David's apartment, Isabella realized that the man beside her wasn't the broken, frightened patient she had first met. He was confident, hopeful, and whole, and the feelings she had for him weren't born from professional duty or sympathy. They were born from genuine admiration and affection for the person he had become. "I want to try this," David said as they reached his door. "I want to see where this goes, without any medical equipment or professional boundaries between us." Isabella smiled, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks. "I want that too," she said. "But we need to do this right. No more nurse and patient, just David and Isabella, figuring out what comes next." As they said goodnight, both of them knew that this was really a beginning. The next chapter of their story would be written as equals, as partners, as to people who had found something beautiful in the midst of tragedy and were brave enough to see where it might lead. Isabella took exactly 1 week to think about David's confession of love. 7 days of working with other patients, 7 nights of lying awake in her own bed, 7 mornings of waking up with David's words echoing in her mind. She talked to her best friend, her sister, and even called her former college roommate for advice. But in the end, the decision came from her heart, not from any outside opinion. On the following Tuesday, Isabella showed up at David's apartment with a grocery bag full of ingredients for his favorite meal and a nervous smile on her face. When he opened the door, she looked directly into his eyes and said the words that would change both their lives forever. "I love you too," she said simply, "and I want to try this, really try this." David's face broke into the biggest smile Isabella had ever seen from him. He pulled her into his arms right there in the doorway, holding her tight as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. But before they could move forward, Isabella knew they needed to handle the professional side of things properly. The next morning, she went to Mrs. Chen's office and requested that David's case be transferred to another nurse for his weekly checkups. "This is highly unusual," Mrs. Chen said, looking at Isabella over her reading glasses. "You've been with this patient for 6 months. Why do you want to transfer him now?" Isabella took a deep breath. "Because I've developed feelings for him that go beyond professional care, and I believe he feels the same way about me. I think it's best if someone else handles his ongoing medical needs." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. "I appreciate your honesty, Isabella, and I have to admit, I've never seen a patient recover as well as David has under your care. Maybe there's something to be said for the healing power of genuine connection." With the professional boundaries officially removed, David and Isabella began dating properly. It was strange at first, learning to relate to each other as equals instead of caregiver and patient. Their first few dates felt almost formal, as if they were both being extra careful not to fall back into old patterns. But gradually, they found their rhythm. David discovered that Isabella loved hiking and had always wanted to visit the mountains outside Seattle. Isabella learned that David was passionate about sustainable architecture and had dreams of designing buildings that could help heal the environment. They found they shared a love of old movies, jazz music, and breakfast for dinner. 3 months into their relationship, they had their first real fight. It started over something small. David had pushed himself too hard during a workout and tweaked his back, and Isabella had immediately shifted into nurse mode, fussing over him and trying to take care of his injury. "I'm fine," David said, more sharply than he intended. "You don't need to take care of me anymore." "I'm not taking care of you because I have to," Isabella shot back. "I'm doing it because I care about you. Are you?" David asked, and Isabella heard years of old pain in his voice. "Or are you with me because taking care of people is what you do? Because I need you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their history. Isabella felt tears start to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "David Williams," she said, her voice steady despite her emotions, "I'm not with you because you need me. I am with you because you make me laugh, because you listen to me when I talk about my work, because you remember how I like my coffee, and because you hold my hand during scary movies. I am with you because you're kind and smart, and because you make me want to be a better person." David's expression softened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I guess I'm still learning how to be loved without it being about what I need." Isabella moved closer to him, taking his hands in hers. "And I'm learning how to love someone without it being about what they need from me. We're both figuring this out as we go." That fight, difficult as it was, marked a turning point in their relationship. They began to see each other more clearly, not as the nurse and patient they had been, but as the people they were becoming together. As spring turned to summer, their relationship deepened. David met Isabella's family, her father, who was initially suspicious of any man dating his daughter, and her younger brother, who immediately liked David's dry sense of humor. Isabella spent time with David's sister, who had flown in from Portland and was amazed by the change in her brother. "I haven't seen him this happy since before Mom left," she told Isabella privately. "Whatever you did to help him heal, it worked." But Isabella knew that David's healing wasn't something she had done to him or for him. It was something they had discovered together, to people who had found in each other what they had been missing in their individual lives. 1 year after the accident, David had a surprise for Isabella. He had been working on a special project for weeks, staying late at his drafting table, making mysterious phone calls, and being generally secretive about his work. "I want to show you something," he said one evening, leading her to the rooftop of his apartment building. When they reached the top, Isabella gasped. David had designed and built a small rooftop garden, complete with raised beds full of vegetables and herbs, comfortable seating areas, and a small water feature that reflected the city lights. "It's beautiful," Isabella breathed, walking among the plants. But why up here? David smiled. Because you told me once that you always wanted a garden but never had the space. And because I wanted to create something beautiful for you, something that would grow and flourish. Just like we have. Isabella turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. David, this is incredible. But you didn't have to do all this. For me, I didn't do it for you, David said, pulling her close. I did it for us. For the life we're building together. That night, as they sat in the garden under the stars, David asked Isabella to marry him. It wasn't a grand, elaborate proposal, just a simple, heartfelt question from a man who had learned that the most profound love often comes from the most unexpected places. Isabella said yes without hesitation. They were married the following spring in a small ceremony at the hospital chapel where David had first opened his eyes. After the accident, Isabella wore her grandmother's wedding dress, and David walked down the aisle without any assistance, his steps steady and sure doubt in his wedding vows. David spoke about how Isabella had saved his life in more ways than one. You didn't just help me walk again, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You helped me learn how to live again, how to trust again, how to love again. Isabella's vows were equally moving. I thought I knew what it meant to care for someone, she said, but you taught me the difference between taking care of someone and truly loving them. You taught me that the best kind of healing happens when two people choose to build something beautiful together. 2 years later, David and Isabella started a non-profit organization that paired recovering patients with volunteers who could provide emotional support during the healing process. They had learned that physical recovery was only part of the journey, that true healing required human connection, hope, and the knowledge that someone cared enough to refuse to let you face your struggles alone. Their own story had become a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of human connection, and the beautiful truth that sometimes the most profound love grows from the deepest pain. David never forgot the night when Isabella first refused to let him sleep alone. And Isabella never forgot the moment when David first trusted her enough to let her see his broken heart. Together, they had learned that healing wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose to do with someone who cared enough to stay by your side through the darkest nights and celebrate with you. When the morning finally came, their love story continued to unfold, day by day, choice by choice, to people who had found in each other not just a partner, but a home. And every night, as they fell asleep side by side, they were grateful for the accident that had brought them together and the love that had helped them both become whole.